everyone, are you aware of the mandatory reporting system for abuse against persons with disabilities? Under Article 59-4 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, individuals and professions who are in close proximity to persons with disabilities and can easily recognize the risk of abuse, such as facility staff, medical professionals, and teachers, are legally obligated to report any known or suspected cases of abuse. This system is not a mere recommendation. It is a legally mandated obligation clearly defined by law to protect the human rights and lives of persons with disabilities. If you fail to report abuse against persons with disabilities despite being aware of it, the person with a disability will be exposed to a greater risk of further abuse. Furthermore, mandatory reporters will be held legally liable. Your report stops the abuse, and it can be the most crucial starting point for the recovery of the victims with disabilities' life. I hope today's training serves as an opportunity to clearly reaffirm your roles and responsibilities as mandatory reporters.
Human rights are the most fundamental rights that every person is entitled to enjoy. Human rights are fundamental rights that must be guaranteed, as stipulated in the Constitution, the international human rights treaties joined and ratified by our country, and relevant laws they apply equally to everyone. In particular, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities clearly defines the rights of persons with disabilities to participate fully and effectively in society with dignity and autonomy. And the Republic of Korea, having ratified this convention, is obligated to guarantee those rights. However, in many corners of our society, there are still people living their lives without being able to enjoy those very rights. Children, who should be protected within their families, live with the scars of abuse. Within our communities, persons with disabilities may be crumbling in the face of violence and discrimination. Senior citizens, who deserve to spend their remaining years with dignity, may be merely enduring each day in fear of abuse. The realities that are currently invisible to us or easily overlooked are the very dark sides of a society where human rights are not guaranteed, and they are happening at this very moment.
In our society, a diverse range of people with different ages, genders, cultures, and personalities live together in harmony. Regardless of disability or non-disability, we are all members who build this society together. Instead of singling out or excluding someone based on disability, it is necessary to respect and understand them as they are. To respect diversity is, in essence, to respect human rights. Regardless of disability or non-disability, every individual must be respected as a member of our society with equal rights and dignity.
Wait, shall we take a closer look at disability? The term disability is commonly used in our daily lives. However, it is not easy to clearly define what constitutes a disability, or who should be identified as a person with a disability. While the dictionary definition of disability refers to a state where physical organs do not function properly or there is a mental impairment, this alone is not sufficient to explain the full meaning of disability. The meaning of disability is constantly evolving and expanding, following the overall improvement of human rights awareness and changes in societal perceptions within our society. In the past, disability was viewed as an individual problem caused by physical impairment that one had to overcome alone. However, the meaning and concept have now evolved to recognize disability as something that arises from the interaction between an individual and various environmental factors in society. The scope of recognizing disability also varies from country to country. In the case of the Republic of Korea, disability is recognized through a formal disability registration system. However, In many countries often referred to as developed nations, disability is also recognized when participation and activities in society are restricted due to the interaction between environmental factors such as cultural, physical, and institutional barriers and an individual's physical or mental capacities. In fact, the United States views obesity as a disability, and Sweden considers foreign immigrants who cannot speak the national language as persons with disabilities, providing them with various accommodations and welfare services. The definition of a person with a disability in the Republic of Korea is stipulated in the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities. According to Article 2 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, a person with a disability is defined as someone who suffers from substantial limitations in their daily or social life for a long period due to physical or mental impairments. This defines disability based on medical criteria centered on functional impairment. Furthermore, a disability registration system is in place to determine the categories of disability eligible for national policies and services, limiting the types of disability to 15. However, the scope of disability is expanding due to shifts in how disability is perceived. Types of disabilities are broadly classified into physical disabilities and mental disabilities. Physical disabilities involve impairments of external bodily functions, including physical disability, visual impairment, hearing impairment, speech impairment, brain lesions, and facial disfigurement. Disabilities of internal organs include heart impairment, kidney impairment, liver impairment, ostomy, respiratory impairment, and epilepsy. Mental disabilities include intellectual disability, autistic disorder, and mental disorders. In particular, with the enactment of the Act on Guarantee of Rights of and Support for Persons with Developmental Disabilities in 2014, the term persons with developmental disabilities has been used to encompass both intellectual and autistic disabilities. Since 2021, the criteria for disability recognition have been relaxed for certain diseases and impairments among the 15 disability types, allowing for easier disability registration. Examples include complex regional pain syndrome, diplopia, vitiligo, and Tourette's disorder. Furthermore, starting in 2026, pancreatic impairment will be included, expanding the classification to 16 types of disabilities. So, what is the population of persons with disabilities in our country? As of 2024, the registered population of persons with disabilities is approximately 2.63 million, accounting for about 5.1% of the total population. By type of disability, the highest proportions are physical disability 43.0%, followed by hearing impairment 16.8%, visual impairment 9.4%, brain lesions 8.9%, and intellectual disability 8.9%. Among these, the number of persons with developmental disabilities is showing a gradual upward trend. In the past, disability often resulted from congenital causes or the limitations of medical technology. However, in recent years, acquired disabilities caused by industrial accidents, other accidents, and an aging population have been rising, leading to a steady increase in the total population of persons with disabilities. What are the difficulties arising from disability in our society? Anyone experiences hardship when subjected to discrimination and exclusion. Furthermore, the difficulties and needs experienced by each individual vary depending on their personal characteristics and environment. Let's examine some of the difficulties associated with different types of disabilities. In particular, the difficulties faced by persons with disabilities can be described as barriers arising from the lack of social support. Persons with developmental disabilities may experience difficulties in interpersonal relationships and social life because their cognitive functions, communication styles, and methods of interaction differ from those without disabilities. Persons with mental disorders may find it difficult to maintain daily life due to delusions, hallucinations, or impairments in thought and mood. Persons with hearing impairments may face challenges in communication and mobility because abnormalities in the auditory nerve affect sound perception and the ability to maintain balance. Persons with brain lesions experience difficulties in walking, movement, and activities of daily living due to cerebral palsy or brain damage caused by trauma. The crucial point is that the difficulties and social barriers experienced by each person with a disability are entirely different. For instance, even for someone with a physical disability, the difficulty in moving is reduced if an elevator is available. However, if there are only stairs, their mobility will be restricted.
Do you now have a good understanding of the basic concepts of disability? Then, how is disability actually perceived in our society? Our society still views disability through the lens of deficiency and vulnerability. People with disabilities are often regarded merely as lacking or as inherently frail beings. Such perceptions confine persons with disabilities to being mere objects of protection and charity. It frames them not as equal members of society, but as beings who are constantly in need of someone else's help. However, the problem does not stop there. The gaze that views them as weak leads to discrimination and exclusion, and ultimately, to the even greater problem of abuse. Disregard and neglect carried out in the name of care. Violence and control occurring under the guise of protection. In such environments, persons with disabilities are stripped of their rights and dignity, making it difficult for them even to raise their voices. However, disability is by no means a deficiency. It is simply one of the many facets of diversity that exist within our society. Furthermore, it is a part of life that anyone can experience. Only when we shift our perspective away from viewing disability solely as a vulnerability can persons with disabilities stand as equal, respected members of society, rather than as objects of abuse. Proper understanding of disability. In fact, it is not something grand, but rather a fundamental attitude that everyone should possess. And it will be the first step toward a society that is more equal and where everyone is respected.
What are your thoughts on disability?
Disability abuse is still occurring in various parts of our society. Do you happen to know how frequently disability abuse occurs around us? Throughout the year 2024, the number of reports received by disability advocacy agencies across the country reached 6,000 cases. While these may seem like mere statistics, behind each number is a suffering individual and a shattered daily life. A look at the perpetrators reveals a wide range of individuals, including strangers, acquaintances, family members, relatives, and even those closest to the victim, such as parents. Furthermore, a significant number of abuse cases are committed by staff members at social welfare facilities or institutions. The locations where disability abuse occurs are also diverse. It happens not only at home, workplaces, commercial facilities, social welfare centers, hospitals, and schools, but also in virtual spaces online. In other words, this shows that disability abuse is not confined to specific areas but can occur anywhere in our daily lives. The types of abuse are not limited to physical abuse. They take many diverse forms, including economic exploitation, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, as well as abandonment and neglect. Although the aspects of disability abuse may vary, they all share a common thread. It is the fact that disability abuse gravely violates the dignity and rights of the victim. What we must observe closely here is the fact that the vast majority of abused persons with disabilities are those with severe disabilities. Persons with severe disabilities account for 94% of all victims, with the victimization of those with developmental disabilities being particularly prominent. Notably, among the 15 types of disabilities, the abuse rate for persons with intellectual disabilities is the highest at 65%. In other words, this means that persons with developmental disabilities, who face significant cognitive and communication challenges, are more frequently exposed to human rights violations such as discrimination, exclusion, and abuse. Therefore, this is a disability type that we must observe with even greater care and attention. It is crucial for mandatory reporters to keep this reality in mind. You may have witnessed disability abuse or heard about it from someone else. As we go through various cases of abuse, please take a moment to reflect on whether there were any instances occurring around you that you might have overlooked.
One day, while living in the facility, Mr. Young-sik was summoned by the director regarding the use of paid content on computers and mobile phones. The director forced Mr. Young-sik to kneel on a chair, claiming it was for discipline. After forcing him to sit with his back turned and the soles of his feet exposed, the director took out a stored iron bar and attempted to strike his feet. There were other residents nearby who witnessed this scene. Prior to that, the director had a telephone conversation with Mr. Young-sik's mother. "Ma'am, since there is an issue with Young-sik's behavior, I will be disciplining him." With these words, the director disguised his actions as legitimate guidance, but in reality, it was a display of threats and violence fueled by fear. The director considered this to be discipline, but the reality is that it was a clear act of abuse. It was an attempt to crush dignity and suppress behavior through fear. Ms. Ok-sun lost her parents at an early age and, as an adult, lived alone, far away from her family. An aunt living in the same neighborhood said, "I'll take good care of your money for you." Having no one else to trust or rely on, Ms. Ok-sun handed over her subsidy bank book. However, after receiving the bank book, the aunt used most of the basic livelihood security benefits and disability pensions deposited every month for herself. She provided Ms. Ok-sun with only a small amount of pocket money, claiming it was for living expenses. Ultimately, Ms. Ok-sun was unable to use her own money freely and was exploited of her economic rights. This case is not just a simple family matter. It is economic exploitation and a clear violation of human rights. Mr. Minho, who has physical difficulties, was regularly using a medical facility for his rehabilitation treatment. When he complained about discomfort during the process, he was simply told, "You have to endure it for your rehab." Furthermore, some staff members mocked him by laughing and saying, "Your pronunciation is weird," claiming they couldn't understand him. Minho had to feel fear and shame due to coercion and neglect during the treatment process. This is not a matter of simple unkindness or a misunderstanding. It is a clear act of abuse that forced physical pain and left emotional scars under the pretext of treatment. Although Minjae was attending a general education class, he gradually became isolated during lessons. Citing communication difficulties, the teacher seated Minjae at the back of the classroom and made no active effort to encourage his participation in class. Even when assigning tasks, the teacher told him, "You can do it or not," and he was never given opportunities to mingle with his peers. At lunchtime, Minjae had to eat alone or was sometimes left in the classroom to spend time by himself. Even when he tried to ask for help, the teacher and support staff frequently ignored him, claiming they were too busy. Ultimately, although Minjae was attending school, he was perceived as an invisible child in a corner of the classroom, deprived of both the right to learn and the right to be with his peers. This is not a matter of simple educational shortcomings or limitations. It is a clear case of neglect, where a student with a disability was abandoned within the educational setting and excluded from both learning and social relationships. Ji-hai was usually shy, but she came to trust and follow an acquaintance in the neighborhood who approached her kindly. One day, the acquaintance said, "Let's hang out, I'll buy you something delicious." Ji-hai naturally followed him to his house. At first, they seemed to talk and eat together, but soon uncomfortable physical contact ensued. Ji-hai tried to refuse, but she was unable to properly resist or escape the situation. The perpetrator coaxed her, saying, "It's okay, everyone does it." Following the incident, Ji-hee felt immense anxiety and humiliation. However, she did not know to whom or how she should speak about it. She was even more consumed by the fear that no one would believe her even if she did speak up. Nevertheless, she tried to express the situation in her own way through brief words, but no one noticed. Ultimately, Ji-hai had to endure the pain alone, and the abuse persisted for a long time without being revealed. Voices asking for help can sometimes be difficult to hear. Only when we observe more sensitively and listen closely can we recognize even the subtlest signals. We must remember that social indifference exacerbates the harm.
So far, we have looked at several cases together. However, in reality, even more diverse forms of abuse are occurring all around us. Have you ever witnessed such a situation yourself? If so, did you report it immediately at that moment? Or did you hesitate, wondering if it was truly abuse? Or spend time worrying because it was difficult to judge? As a mandatory reporter, you must be able to respond more sensitively to potential abuse.
Wait a moment. Shall we take a closer look about abuse against persons with disabilities? The types of disability abuse can be broadly classified into 5 categories. They are physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, economic exploitation, abandonment, and neglect. First, we will look at physical abuse. Physical abuse refers to physical violence or cruel treatment against persons with disabilities, such as assault, injury, and confinement. It also includes corporal punishment, physical hazing, forced abortion, tattooing, sterilization, and the damage or unauthorized operation of assistive devices. Then, what are the signs to look for? Cases where unexplained wounds or injuries appear repeatedly, cases where there are traces of being tied up or restrained on the body. Also, there are instances where new wounds appear before old ones have even healed. Furthermore, physical abuse can be suspected when a person shows fear or avoids specific places or individuals. There is something important to note here. Physical abuse does not necessarily require a clear purpose or intent to be established. If the perpetrator was aware of the risk of harm and tolerated it, that in itself can constitute abuse. Moreover, even without direct physical contact, actions such as swearing while swinging or throwing hands, feet, or objects can be judged as physical abuse under the Welfare of Persons with Disabilities Act. Emotional abuse is cases where the mental health of a person with a disability is harmed or a risk of such harm is created specifically, emotional violence or cruel treatment, such as threats, harassment, and insults. What are the signs that suggest emotional abuse? Cases where an individual avoids or refuses specific places or people, cases of showing excessive tension or experiencing anxiety. They may also suffer from sleep disorders, depression, lethargy, or even suicidal ideation. Important signals include being overly submissive to a certain person, a noticeable drop in self-esteem, or sudden changes in behavior. When such signs appear, emotional abuse should be suspected. Emotional abuse is particularly difficult to detect unless the disabled victim speaks out directly. Therefore, when a mandatory reporter notices these signs, it is most important to create an environment where the disabled victim feels comfortable speaking up. Then, in what ways does emotional abuse occur? Verbal methods may include abusive language, threats, insults, or disparaging remarks. And nonverbal methods include being ignored, mocked, or socially excluded. In short, it is important to remember that it can manifest in various forms in daily life, even if it is not visible to the eye. Any act that causes sexual humiliation, insult, or pain constitutes sexual abuse. Specifically, it refers to sexual violence or cruel treatment against persons with disabilities, including sexual harassment, sexual molestation, and rape. What kind of actions constitute sexual abuse? It includes rape, forcible molestation, luring or coercing into prostitution, sexual harassment, forcing sexual acts with specific individuals, compelling acts that cause sexual humiliation, and filming or distributing images of sexual acts or the victim's body. Then, what are the signs that suggest sexual abuse? Cases where traces such as physical bruises, sexually transmitted diseases, or genital infections appear. There are cases where clothing is torn or stained. Also, sudden changes in sexual behavior, repetitive sexual expressions, or sexual knowledge and actions inappropriate for one's age are important signals. Sexual abuse is often accompanied by physical and emotional abuse. Therefore, early detection and a swift response are extremely important. Recently, there have been cases where persons with disabilities are featured in internet broadcasts to create suggestive or sexually explicit content. This is clearly disability abuse and constitutes sexual abuse. Then, if the victim did not clearly express a refusal to the sexual act, is it still sexual abuse? Yes, it is sexual abuse. If the victim has difficulty exercising their right to self-determination due to a disability, it can constitute sexual abuse even if they did not show refusal or express pain. In particular, sexual abuse must be judged by comprehensively considering the victim's type and level of disability, the circumstances at the time of the incident, and the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. What is economic exploitation? It refers to actions that cause economic loss to persons with disabilities by taking advantage of their vulnerability, such as exploiting their property or labor and infringing upon their property rights. This is a type of abuse that occurs prominently in cases of disability abuse. Then, what types of property are subject to economic exploitation? It includes not only cash, goods, and real estate owned by the person with a disability, but also public benefits, such as basic livelihood security benefits, disability pensions, and disability allowances. In short, any right with monetary value is included. So, what are the specific examples? Cases of forcing labor without paying wages. Cases of forcing someone to act as a guarantor or stealing their identity to incur debt. There are also cases of forcing unfair contracts or the waiver of rights through assault, threats, or deception, deceiving a person with a disability into signing up for insurance and then embezzling the insurance money or the unauthorized use of public benefits provided to a person with a disability by a benefit manager also constitutes economic exploitation. Then, why do we fail to notice these situations? It is because economic exploitation is not easily visible. Then, when should we suspect economic exploitation? For example, not receiving proper wages despite working, or experiencing financial hardship despite having a steady income, or having unpaid bills, despite having the means to pay, loan history that the individual is unaware of. If unexplained financial transactions or contracts are discovered, these are all important signals for detecting economic exploitation. What are abandonment and neglect? Abandonment refers to a person with a duty of care deserting a person with a disability without providing protection. Neglect refers to a person with a duty of care failing to provide basic protection, medical treatment, or other necessities. Then, from what signs can we suspect abandonment and neglect? Underweight, general weakness, or a health condition requiring medical treatment. Poor hygiene of the body, clothing, or living space. Inappropriate living environments or clothing that is not suited for the season are also important signals. In particular, abandonment may be suspected when there is a sudden severance of the relationship or loss of contact with the caregiver. Furthermore, when a caregiver refuses to provide medical, welfare, or educational services, the possibility of neglect should be examined. Then, can anyone be a perpetrator of abandonment or neglect? No, that's not the case. Abandonment and neglect are recognized as abuse only when committed by a person with a duty of care. Persons with a duty of care include not only family members, but also legal guardians, welfare facility staff, personal assistance services providers, cohabitants, and employers. Essentially, anyone who protects or supervises a person with a disability. Currently, only abandonment and neglect committed by a person with a duty of care are recognized as the acts of abuse. So far, we have examined the types of abuse and the signs associated with each type. However, it is important to note that abuse in reality rarely manifests as just a single type. In many cases, two or more types occur simultaneously, such as physical and emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse, or economic exploitation and neglect. Furthermore, if such abuse is not promptly detected and reported, it tends to persist for a considerable period. The suffering experienced by victims of disability abuse goes far beyond what we can simply imagine. From physical wounds to emotional scars, they may endure suffering so deep and severe that it shatters their entire life.
Do you understand the types and signs of disability abuse? In addition to what I mentioned earlier, there are many different signs of abuse. If you ever feel that someone may be being abused, you should report it without hesitation. In fact, the greatest power to stop abuse against persons with disabilities begins with everyone's attention. Abuse is not just an individual problem. Discriminatory perspectives that view persons with disabilities as different, a social atmosphere that takes abuse lightly, and insufficient systems and services, all of these factors are intertwined to create abuse. Then, what happens to persons with disabilities who suffer from abuse? It is not just the visible scars that remain. First and foremost, dignity collapses. When people feel that their very existence is not respected, they begin to view themselves as worthless. Then, relationships collapse. The moment a trusted family member or caregiver becomes a perpetrator, trust is shattered, and social isolation deepens. Ultimately, the person's entire life begins to shake. Daily life is filled with anxiety, self-esteem crumbles, and they lose even the strength to dream of a future. Therefore, abuse is a serious human rights violation that completely destroys dignity, relationships, and life. The law also clearly defines this as a crime. Article 59-9 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities specifies 9 prohibited acts. Regardless of disability registration, A mandatory reporter must report abuse if they determine that a person who appears to have a disability is suffering from abuse. If mandatory reporters violate this duty, they may even face criminal punishment. Abuse against persons with disabilities is strictly a crime, and it is an act of trampling on someone's human rights.
If the person suffering from abuse were you or your own family, how would life change?
You are mandatory reporter of disability abuse. Our society operates a mandatory reporter system to prevent disability abuse and to provide swift support when abuse occurs. Then, who are mandatory reporter? It refers to individuals who must report when they directly witness abuse or become aware of circumstances suspecting abuse. Article 59. 4 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities stipulates that anyone who becomes aware of disability abuse or sexual crimes can report it to a disability advocacy agency or an investigative agency. In particular, those who become aware through their professional duties must report it without delay. In other words, mandatory reporters are professionals in occupations that allow them to detect the risk of disability abuse before anyone else. For those working in these professional fields, a legal obligation is imposed to report whenever they become aware of or suspect abuse. And there is one more point you must keep in mind. Article 90 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities stipulates that a fine of up to 3 million KRW may be imposed if a mandatory reporter fails to fulfill their duty to report in cases of committing abuse against a person with a disability. And there is one more important point. Cases where a mandatory reporter, instead, commits abuse against a person with a disability. In such cases, according to the aggravated punishment provisions in Article 88-2 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, the sentence is increased by up to half of the original penalty. Please do not forget the duties and roles assigned to mandatory reporters. Victims of abuse often find it difficult to actively report due to grooming, gaslighting, or cognitive impairment, which may prevent them from recognizing themselves as victims, or they may be reluctant to disclose that they have been victimized. Specifically, this occurs when they have a close or ongoing relationship with the perpetrator, or when they fear the facts of the abuse being revealed to their guardians. Furthermore, abuse is often concealed, prolonged, or repeated. Therefore, prompt reporting can bring an early end to the suffering or prevent secondary victimization. Thus, even in cases of suspicion, early detection by those around the victim and active reporting are more important than anything else.
Wait a second, shall we learn a bit more about the mandatory reporter system? Article 59-4 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, which concerns the reporting duties and procedures for disability abuse and sexual crimes against persons with disabilities, stipulates as follows. Anyone who becomes aware of disability abuse or sexual crimes against persons with disabilities may report it to the National Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities or an investigative agency. In particular, those who perform specific professional duties are assigned more stringent obligations. Furthermore, this article specifically designates the occupational groups of mandatory reporters, so let's take a closer look. The occupations subject to mandatory reporters include social welfare officials and heads or employees of social welfare facilities, including social service agents in social welfare facilities, persons conducting comprehensive service support investigations, activity support personnel, and heads or employees of activity support agencies, medical personnel, and heads of medical institutions, medical technologists, emergency medical technicians, members of 119 Emergency Medical Services, heads and employees of mental health welfare centers, psychiatric medical institutions, mental health nursing facilities, and mental health rehabilitation facilities. Heads and childcare staff of daycare centers, teaching staff and instructors for infants and toddlers, heads and employees of elementary, middle, and high schools, operators, instructors, and employees of private academies, and instructors and employees of teaching institutes, heads and employees of sexual violence counseling centers, protection facilities for victims of sexual violence, and integrated support centers for victims of sexual violence, heads and employees of support facilities for the prevention of prostitution and protection of victims, and heads and employees of counseling centers for victims of prostitution, heads and employees of family violence counseling centers and protection facilities for victims of family violence, heads and employees of healthy family support centers, heads and employees of multicultural family support centers, heads and employees of the National Center for the Rights of the Child and foster care support centers, heads and employees of single-parent family welfare facilities, heads and employees of youth facilities, and heads and employees of youth organizations, heads and employees of youth protection and rehabilitation centers, long-term care providers, and persons conducting investigations for long-term care recognition applications, heads and employees of lifelong education centers for persons with disabilities, and starting from May 2026, heads and drivers of agencies operating special means of transportation, persons providing job performance guidance for persons with disabilities and labor support persons, heads and employees of social service provider agencies with 30 or more full-time employees will also be newly included as mandatory reporters. The Minister of Health and Welfare must provide information on the reporting procedures and methods for disability abuse and sexual crimes to mandatory reporters. The state and local governments also bear responsibility. They must prevent disability abuse and sexual crimes and establish the necessary systems to receive reports at any time. Heads of agencies or facilities to which mandatory reporters belong must conduct mandatory reporting education for their employees and submit the results to the relevant central administrative agencies. This is precisely why the training you are currently receiving is so important. Please keep in mind that this session is a statutory mandatory education that you, as a mandatory reporter, must complete.
So, how should you report disability abuse? When mandatory reporters become aware of abuse during their work, they must report it to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities by calling the number of 1-644-8295 without an area code, or report it to the investigative agencies via 112. When you call the number of 1-644-8295, you will be automatically connected to the nearest local advocacy agency for persons with disabilities. There are various ways to report. In addition to phone calls, reports can be made via email or mail. For those with hearing or speech impairments, reporting channels through text message or KakaoTalk are also available. Of course, you can also report by visiting a local national advocacy agency for persons with disabilities in person. Reporting via KakaoTalk is also simple. First, launch the app and type disability abuse in the search bar. Then, the disability abuse reporting the number of 1-644-8295 channel will appear and select the channel. Click Chat with Agent and type report in the chat window. You will then be able to select your area of residence and be connected directly to an agent to write your report. Reporting via text message is similar. If you send a text to the number of 1-644-8295, a link to connect with a local agency will be sent to you. By selecting the agency you want through this link, you will be connected to an agent and can submit your report via text. So, what information should you provide when reporting? There are three main categories: reporter information, information on the victim with a disability, and information regarding the abuse. First, for the reporter information. Please provide your personal identity details and explain how you became aware of the abuse. Next, for the information on the victim with a disability, please provide their name, address, type and severity of disability, contact information, and the victim's current situation. Finally, for the information regarding the abuse, please provide specific details on how the abuse occurred. The important point here is that you do not necessarily need to know all of this information to make a report. Simply providing the information you know, to the best of your knowledge, so that the victim can be reached is more than enough. Your identity and personal information can remain anonymous. You do not need to hesitate to report even if the information you have is limited. Furthermore, the information provided during the report will only be used to verify the facts of the abuse and to protect and support victims with disabilities. It will never be used for any other purpose. Have you ever hesitated to report, worrying that your identity might be revealed or that you might face disadvantages? You don't need to worry. Those who report abuse against victims with disabilities are strictly protected by law. Article 59-6 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities applies. Articles 7 through 13 of the Act on Protection of Specific Crime Informants mutatis mutandis to ensure the protection of reporters. Furthermore, under Article 59-5 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, no disadvantages shall be imposed for reporting abuse or sexual crimes against persons with disabilities, and violators will face legal punishment. Then, what exactly constitutes disadvantageous actions? These include measures leading to job loss, unfair personnel transfers, wage discrimination, and any disadvantages regarding working conditions. Should you encounter such a situation, you can request a consultation with the National Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities or apply for a prohibition of disadvantageous actions through the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission. According to Article 86-2 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, anyone who causes a reporter to lose their status, obstructs reporting, or coerces the cancellation of a report shall be punished by up to 2 years in prison or a fine of up to 20 million won. Others who impose disadvantages shall face up to 1 year in prison or a fine of up to 10 million won. Furthermore, investigative agencies must not record the personal information of the reporter, nor disclose or report any facts that could reveal the identity of the person who reported abuse against victims with disabilities. If there are concerns about retaliation, you may request personal safety measures from the chief of the police station. Access to information regarding the reporter is strictly restricted. Anyone who reveals, discloses, or reports the identity of a reporter shall be subject to imprisonment for up to 3 years or a fine of up to 30 million won. Legal safeguards are in place to ensure that those who courageously report abuse against persons with disabilities do not face any disadvantages. Furthermore, under Article 2 of the Protection of Public Interest Reporters Act, if a reporter faces retaliation, they can receive practical support through the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, including personal protection measures, applications to prohibit disadvantageous actions, and the payment of rewards or relief funds. These protections apply equally to mandatory reporters, allowing you to safely fulfill your role in reporting for the public interest. So please feel at ease. And if you witness or hear about any victims with disabilities suffering from abuse, do not hesitate to report it. If you suspect abuse but are hesitant about whether to report it, please contact or report to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities. Through an investigation, the agency determines whether abuse has occurred. If not, the case will be closed. Please feel at ease. If abuse is suspected, it is necessary to report it immediately to the National Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities.
Just a moment. Shall we learn a bit more about the National Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities? Mandatory reporters must be well informed about the National Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities in relation to abuse against persons with disabilities. This agency is established and operated based on Article 59-11 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities. Article 59-10 of the same Act stipulates that the state and local governments must establish policies and build as well as operate reporting systems to prevent and stop abuse against persons with disabilities. As of 2025, there is one central national advocacy agency for persons with disabilities supporting local branches, and 19 regional agencies established at the provincial and municipal levels nationwide. Among them, Gyeonggi-do and Cheongcheongbuk-do each operate 2 agencies. Then, what exactly does the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities do? It receives reports of abuse, conducts on-site investigations, and provides protection for victims with disabilities when necessary. It also provides counseling and follow-up care for victims with disabilities, their families, and the perpetrators. Furthermore, it supports the protection and recovery of victims with disabilities and carries out projects to promote human rights and improve social systems. Mandatory reporters. Please remember, if you dial 11448-295 without an area code, you will be automatically connected to the nearest local advocacy agency for persons with disabilities. Anyone can easily report abuse and receive the necessary assistance.
When a case of abuse against persons with disabilities occurs and a mandatory reporter makes a report, how does the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities respond? First, once the report is received, an on-site investigation is conducted. If anyone obstructs or refuses this investigation, a fine may be imposed. If emergency measures are needed at the scene, the victim with a disability is separated from the perpetrator and protected in a safe space. Afterwards, a case meeting is held to determine whether abuse occurred, and if necessary, a final decision is made through the Case Review Committee on Abuse of Persons with Disabilities. Then, support for the victim's recovery follows, and even after the case is closed, follow-up monitoring continues to prevent recurrence. The support available to victims of disabilities is very diverse. Medical diagnosis and treatment for trauma or illness caused by abuse are provided, and psychological stability and recovery are also supported through expert counseling and treatment. Residential support, such as application for rental housing, connection to shelter, and support for self-reliance, is also provided to ensure that people can live safely in the community. In addition, legal assistance is provided to report abusers and assist with investigations and litigation. This includes connecting victims with legal aid organizations and advocates to ensure their legal rights are protected. It also extends to welfare support, such as helping unregistered persons with disabilities with their registration or connecting them with emergency welfare services and local resources to assist in all aspects of their lives. Ultimately, victims with disabilities receive comprehensive recovery support across medical, psychological, residential, judicial, and general welfare areas, going far beyond simple protection. And all of these processes ultimately begin with your report. Your single choice can empower someone to enjoy an ordinary life once again. Then, how has the life of victim with disabilities changed because of a report from a mandatory reporter?
Subin, a 22-year-old with an intellectual disability, has lived in fear and pain, suffering from physical abuse by her family for years. Then one day, a social welfare civil servant noticed unusual signs in Subin. There were long-standing bruises on her arms, and she was often seen flinching and cowering even at a light touch. Without hesitation, they reported the abuse to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities. And that single report became a turning point in Subin's life as one of the victims with disabilities. Immediately after the report, Subin was separated from her family and received protection at a shelter. However, the sudden separation and memories of long-term abuse left deep scars. Due to disappointment toward her family, fear, and an unstable psychological state, it was not even easy for her to open her heart. But it didn't stop there. The Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities continued to provide multifaceted support so that Subin could stand on her feet again. Through counseling, her emotional wounds were gradually healed, and residential support was connected to ensure a stable life. Furthermore, they supported her in finding a job to start working, helping her prepare to stand independently within the local community. A year has passed, and Subin's appearance has changed noticeably. Her once dark expression has brightened, and she has begun to express her thoughts to others without hesitation. Most importantly, as she started working, she is moving toward a greater goal of independence within the local community. Subin says, "My past life felt like a prison, but now I feel like I am in heaven." The care of a single person has transformed the life of this individual among victims with disabilities. Kyung-jun, a 35-year-old with low vision, was living a diligent life, working quietly at a small local factory. However, at his workplace, he constantly had to endure ridicule and discrimination under the guise of jokes. His colleagues took advantage of the fact that Kyung-jun could not see well. They would intentionally place items in the wrong spots and mock him, saying, "You can't even find that?" or even move his chair away to make him fall. Even the accounting officer embezzled part of his wages, thinking that Kyung-jun would not be able to verify them properly. On the outside, Kyung-jun seemed to be enduring it, but his heart was slowly breaking. However, he couldn't say a word because he was terrified of being fired. Then one day, a social worker in charge of post-employment support noticed something strange. A darker expression than before, an anxious attitude, and unexplained bruises and wounds. Without hesitation, the social worker reported it to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities, and an on-site investigation was conducted immediately. The investigation revealed that Kyung-jun had been suffering from continuous physical and emotional abuse, as well as economic exploitation at his workplace. The perpetrators faced legal punishment, and through legal support, Kyung-jun was able to recover his exploited wages. Furthermore, along with psychological counseling, he was connected to a safer vocational rehabilitation center and was able to secure a new job. A few months later, Kyung-jun, whom we met again, said, "Back then, every day was filled with fear, but now I have found the courage to work again. Now, I feel that I am being respected." Kyung-jun's transformation began with the attentive care and keen observation of a mandatory reporter. It allowed him, as one of the victims with disabilities, to reclaim the life that every person deserves to live with respect. Mireille, a 25-year-old with a physical disability, was living her life with the support of an activity assistant. On the surface, she seemed to be living an ordinary day, but in a corner of her heart, an unspoken anxiety was taking root. Not long ago, a friend she met on social media urgently asked to borrow money, and out of sympathy, she handed over 500,000 won. However, even after the promised date passed, the money was not returned. Not only that, but the friend's demands became increasingly bold. They even went as far as making dangerous requests, such as asking her to open a new mobile phone line or to take out a loan together. It was the activity assistant who found out about this. While having a casual conversation, Mireille opened up about lending money and not being able to get it back. Although there was no clear evidence, the activity assistant, sensing that something was wrong, immediately reported it to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities. The results of the investigation were shocking. It was confirmed that the situation went beyond simply lending cash. There were also attempts to open a new mobile phone line and take out a loan. Fortunately, through prompt intervention, the disbursement of the loan was stopped, and after identifying the status of the mobile phone activation, a formal complaint was filed with the police. Thanks to the Activity Assistance Prompt Report, not only the visible damage, but also hidden additional facts of abuse against victims with disabilities were uncovered, and above all, the spread of further damage was prevented. A few days later, Mireille, who had regained her peace of mind, said, "It could have been a disaster if it had been discovered any later. I feel relieved now. I was only suffering in silence, so knowing that there is someone watching over me with care gives me great strength." One person's report can prevent abuse against victims with disabilities or stop the damage from spreading further.
How did you feel about the cases we have seen so far? You have witnessed how a single report from a mandatory reporter has the power to transform someone's life. Reporting abuse is not merely a legal duty. It is a vital starting point for protecting someone's dignity and rebuilding a shattered life. If you ever encounter a moment where abuse is suspected, please do not hesitate to report it. Your report is equivalent to giving victims with disabilities the courage to live again.
Are you a mandatory reporter of abuse against persons with disabilities? If you witness, hear about, or suspect abuse against persons with disabilities, will you report it? Now, shall we wrap up the key points we've learned so far through a Q&A session? No, that is not the case. According to Article 59-4 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, anyone who becomes aware of instances of abuse or sexual crimes against persons with disabilities may report them to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities or an investigative agency. However, mandatory reporters bear a heavier responsibility. They must report without delay if they become aware of abuse or sexual crimes against persons with disabilities in the course of their duties. Failure to fulfill this obligation may result in an administrative fine of up to 3 million won, according to Article 90 of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities. Another important point is that if a mandatory reporter commits an act of abuse themselves, they will face aggravated punishment with the sentence increased by up to half, according to Article 88(2) of the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities. Yes, that is correct. Abuse often occurs in secret, so it can be difficult to secure clear evidence. However, you must report even if you only suspect the situation. If you are hesitant to report because you only have suspicions, you can consult with or report to the Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities. Please do not hesitate just because you are unsure, as experts will conduct a fact-finding investigation. You do not need to worry at all. According to the Act on Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, the Act on the Protection of Reporters, etc., of Specific Crimes, and the Protection of Public Interest Reporters Act, reporters are strictly protected by law. Protection is guaranteed so that your identity is not disclosed and you do not face any disadvantages, and if this is violated, those responsible will be subject to punishment. In addition, if a reporter faces disadvantages according to the Protection of Public Interest Reporters Act, practical support is guaranteed through rewards and relief fund systems. This system applies equally to mandatory reporters, allowing you to safely report for the public interest. No, that is not necessary. It is sufficient for the reporter to provide information within the scope of what they know. You can report based only on identifiable information, such as the name and address of the victim with disabilities or a description of the situation. The Advocacy Agency for Persons with Disabilities conducts on-site investigations and emergency protection and connects the victim with disabilities to medical, psychological, legal, and welfare support for their recovery. Reporting is not just a simple notification, but the first step toward protecting and aiding the recovery of the victim with disabilities.
You are a mandatory reporter of abuse against persons with disabilities. Reporting such abuse is a responsibility and a duty that our society has promised to fulfill in order to uphold each other's dignity. Abuse destroys a person's life. One's value as a human being is unrecognized, relationships are severed, and eventually, the person's daily life collapses. However, your careful attention and voice can become the strength that helps rebuild a collapsed life. Abuse against persons with disabilities is a reality that none of us can turn away from, and it is a social task that we must resolve together. At the same time, it is a problem that can be prevented through our mutual concern. As a mandatory reporter, will you join us on this path toward creating a society where everyone is respected?
You are a mandatory reporter of abuse against persons with disabilities. What is the report number for disability abuse that every mandatory reporter must remember?